So the picture that Jesus gives us in this parable of a successful farmer whose lands have produced so much food, corn, grain, grapes, vegetables. We don't know what kind of a farm he had, but so much was produced that he didn't have room in his barns to store it all. That may not be so far-fetched after all. Our modern farms are mechanized with better seed and fertilizer, but a bumper crop was even possible in ancient agrarian societies. You may remember the parable of the sower we talked about a month or so ago. So some seed fell here, died off, some seed fell here, got choked off, some seed this and that. But the seed that fell in the good soil was well tended, had the rain, had what it needed, grew 30 times, 60 times, 100 times as much as was planted. Barnfuls. In fact, that's how the cities could grow in the ancient world, since the population of cities did not farm for themselves. You see, urban people had to live from the annual surplus that the farmers were producing. Empires ran on other people's food. Generally, rulers in cities had the official authority to confiscate the surplus. They did it first through tithes, through taxes, through tolls, through tribute. And because they had the military weapons and they had the police powers to do so, and they had all the retainers of government officials, they simply took it. It was a rare farmer in those days who got to keep what he grew for himself, unless he was well connected to the powerful, to the elite families who needed food, to the governing class, as in Nigeria, who wanted it all for themselves. So Jesus told a story about a man whose investment in land and labor had paid off big time. He knew he had ample net worth stored in his barns to provide good things for his present enjoyment and for his future needs. He was rich with tangible, material goods, food and drink and shelter and clothing, sufficient for the day, yes, and also for the foreseeable future, forever. Got it all. You would think we should feel good for this fellow, because he's been lucky. He's gotten to where most of us would like to be. He's applied himself, he's invested well, he's reaped a generous reward of good things in life, and then some. He's got it made in the shade. God has blessed him, definitely. Wait a minute, why? At this late in my sermon, should I bring up God? I mean, why should the rich guy in Jesus' parable give any credit to God for his material success? Self-made man, right? Isn't that the image we like? Did it all on his own, owed nothing to nobody. Well, first you could say God gave him those good things by providing sufficient rain. Sufficient. Not in excess to where there'd be a flood and wash it all away, and not too little which would precipitate a drought. Just right. And God provided the rich harvest through sufficient sunshine. And no charge for that solar power. And fertile soil. And the germination of new life in those hard, dry seeds. Farmer didn't do any of that. Wouldn't know how to tweak the genome. The guy was set for life. And it really wasn't through any cleverness on his part. He had inherited a plot of land from his father. It had the right kind of soil. That was lucky. And he invested in good seed and in good workers. The farmer comes across to us as very successful. Although he did not really do it all on his own, he just thinks he did. He has more than enough for himself and his family, more than what's necessary, more than what would be sufficient to sustain life. He has much more than that. It's a picture of prosperity. And there are some churches probably on this Sunday morning who are preaching a prosperity gospel like what he did is what we're all aiming for, that's the kingdom of God, richer than Croesus, swimming in coins like Uncle Scrooge. Well, thanks to the productive soil, thanks to those hard-working field hands, a bountiful harvest, a manager who must have been on top of the inventory. The farm is a resounding success. The farmer is in good shape. He's got a lot of crop under his control. Taken by surprise by such unexpected, enormous good news, the farmer doesn't even have room enough in his storehouses and his silos to put the excess. This is all surplus food. So what shall he do? For one thing, he could have given some of his crop away. I mean, certainly there were some hungry families in his town. This was a peasant-based agrarian economy. And I'll bet his tenant farmers would have appreciated an offer from him to share the bounty. After all, they were the ones who had to work so hard, longer hours. They had to work harder that year all around to bring in this big, much bigger harvest than in years past. That would have only been fair for the farmer to share the excess with the workers who had brought it in. Nowadays, we call that profit sharing. It's a good thing all around. Those who make the millions for the factory or for the institution ought to gain some of the profit. The rich farmer could have shown himself to be generous that way. He could have shown himself to be benevolent. A real philanthropist. Philanthropist simply means love of humanity. He could have doubled his workers' wages on the spot. He could have paid them in produce. Since they were co-workers who did the labor, he owned the land. Yes, he did, but he didn't own them. Why should he assume that the entire crop belonged to him? Or, as a faithful Jew, the farmer could have brought the tithe, that is the tenth of it, as an offering to God, who had given him the harvest in the first place. A tithe was required under Jewish law. But he could have added more. He could have doubled down. Bring 20%, 40%. Consider it a thanksgiving offering. Consider it a community gift for the flourishing of the whole, the common good. Did anybody talk about that anymore? The common good. After all, what's a little extra to a man who has obvious, conspicuous excess? Or, if he didn't share it with his workers or give it to his church, he could have left a greater portion of it out in the fields unharvested, as he was supposed to do under Jewish law anyway. The gleaning clause, right, for the migrating poor, for the transients who could pick for themselves some fruit or grain as they passed through town. We talked about that last Sunday. He could have left some of the crop exposed out in the open for the birds and the bees and the insects and the worms, right? Without whose carrying of seeds or pollinating work, this harvest would never have come. He could have composted it into new topsoil. He could have left some of it unharvested to the next growing season to restore the nutrients into the soil as the ground lay fallow, which was prescribed for Jewish people to do, if you're a landowner, every 7 years. Or for heaven's sake, he could have thrown a big party. In keeping with Middle Eastern traditions of hospitality, he could have used all this serendipitous occasion to have fed everybody in the whole countryside at least one good meal. On the house, y'all come. He would have made a name for himself, something to write on his tombstone. This was a good man. But he didn't do any of those things. Instead, he thought only of himself. He made plans, building plans. Tear down these otherwise perfectly sufficient barns, go through all the turmoil and the trauma and the unnecessary expending of resources to build a bigger one, just so he can store everything for later for himself. Self, you got it made in the shade. The very idea is so exaggerated, it should strike us as comic, if not pathetic. It's like Uncle Scrooge McDuck swimming in his pool of money while Donald and Huey and Dewey and Louie are starving. Didn't matter. It would strike us as comic or pathetic if it wasn't such a sad commentary on that man's narrow, self-centered view of life. So Jesus calls this successful man at the peak of his productivity, he calls him fool. Perhaps because the man thought he had done it all on his own. He owed nothing to nobody. Or that his personal prosperity, his own security in life, was all there was to the matter. His short-sighted sense of personal profit made him impervious to the call of God on his soul. It blocked out all other options, any one of which would have been more reasonable, any one of which would have been more compassionate, any one of which would have endeared him to his people as a real mensch, right? He's somebody to be remembered. Instead, the rich farmer blocked out all other people but himself. You know, it's said that a person who's all wrapped up in themselves makes a very small package. And I see in Jesus' description of this wealthy narcissist a perfect example of a capitalist with no social conscience. When you see the whole picture then, any person who would choose to be like that man, rich in things but lacking any eternal or social value, appears comic, pathetic. Maybe that's why we don't have cartoons with Uncle Scrooge McDuck anymore. It pinches too much. Now please notice, when the man lost his fortune in the end, it wasn't a punishment for anything. It occurred simply through the natural process of death. As the old saying goes, there are no pockets in a shroud. You can't take it with you. So what to do with all this abundant estate was no longer his problem. It became a matter for his inheritors to fight over, which, by the way, was the precipitating event that caused Jesus to tell this particular story. Someone came to him and said, "Tell my brother to divide the inheritance that he has received with me." And Jesus said, "Who made me a divider over you?" See, the rich man may have made a foolish decision about what he was going to do with all his accumulated wealth during his life.